we could take our seats, please. We'll begin in just a minute. There we go. Good morning, and welcome to the Built Heritage Subcommittee meeting for February 11, 2019. I would like to call the members to order. Please take your seats. I'd also like to acknowledge that Ottawa is built on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, and would like to thank the Algonquin people for their hospitality. J'aimerais souligner que la ville d'Ottawa se trouve sur un territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, et je tiens à remercier le peuple algonquin pour son hospitalité. Now, before we start into the formal agenda, I would like to thank the three public members in our committee, Carolyn Quinn, Barry Podolsky, and Sandy Smallwood, for their participation today. This will be Sandy's last meeting as a member of this committee, and we would all like to thank him for his service and thoughtful commitment to building a healthy and sustainable community. And even before, yes. He's been a member of Built Heritage Subcommittee in its current form since it started in, we believe, 2013. And even before that, he served as a member of both the Ottawa and Rockcliffe LACAC committees, so thank you, Sandy. We have a busy 4 years ahead of us for heritage planning, and I'm looking forward to seeing more citywide engagement from urban to rural and from city staff, as well as in cooperation with community groups. We have no regrets today. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes from Thursday, November 15th. Are the minutes confirmed? Confirmed. Thank you. So first, Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development Department, Right-of-Way, Heritage, and Urban Design Services. First on the agenda is designation of the Booth Street Complex, 552, 568 Booth Street, and 405 Rochester Street under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. I know Sally Coots has a presentation, but we also have two motions. And Member Quinn, you have a motion to formally add Document 12, the Heritage Survey Form, to the report. Member Quinn, if you could read the motion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Whereas a heritage survey form provides information on a property's design, physical value, associative historical value, and contextual value, according to the criteria outlined in Regulation 906 for designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. And whereas the heritage survey form for the Booth Street complex was not available when the agenda for this meeting was distributed and was distributed separately at a later time, be it resolved that the Built Heritage Subcommittee amend the report to add Document 12, Heritage Survey Form, as a supporting document to the report.
Is the motion carried?
Carried.
Thank you. Carried. We have a second motion regarding the interior of the buildings. Member Quinn, will you read that for us?
Be it resolved that the Built Heritage Subcommittee amend this report such that the following is added at the end of Document 10, Statement of Cultural Heritage Value. The interiors of all buildings are excluded from this designation.
Is the motion carried? Carried. Thank you. Sally Coots from staff is here to provide an overview of the report. Sally, over to you.
Chair. This report is in front of you today as an application I'll start again. This is the report recommending the designation of the Booth Street complex under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. The site was developed between 1909 to 1952, and the complex was used until the early 20th century. The site is located, 21st century. The site is located between, oh, this doesn't go on the, why did they do this? Is located between Booth and Rochester, Orangeville and Norman Streets, immediately south of the Queensway in Ottawa's near West End. This view shows the buildings on the property were built over a period of 43 years by the Federal Mines Branch and its successors as a semi-industrial area devoted to offices, laboratories, and research facilities to support the federal government's research in fuels, metals, metallurgy, explosives, and minerals. Ottawa architect W. Nofke was the supervising architect for much of the project, although the full extent of his involvement in the actual designs is not clear. This is a bird's eye view of the site, taken quite recently. Even in this view, you can see the characteristics that tie the site together. Flat-roofed red brick buildings with deep foundations, often painted white or parged with light concrete, industrial expression as seen through the windows and door openings, and the tall chimney. As I said, the Booth Street complex ceased to be active in the early 2000s, and the process for the disposal of the lands, which were federally owned, began. The city's heritage section was made aware of disposal of the land and its eventual acquisition by the Canada Lands Company before the process was initiated, and our interest in the possible protection of the federally designated buildings, that's FHBO, Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office, on the site was flagged by us early in our association with Canada Lands and had been flagged by us with NRCan for many years. Upon acquisition, Canada Lands contacted the city to determine our interest in the site, and again we reiterated that we were interested in considering the designation of all previously FHBO designated buildings. We also concluded that the logical time to bring forward the proposed designation was at the same time as the planning applications for the site, to provide council, committee, and the public with a complete picture of the project. As a result, this is in front of you today, and the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment will be in front of Planning Committee on February the 28th, along with this report. My colleague, Aaron O'Connell, who's sitting with me, is the land use planner on that site and can answer any questions today about the planning applications. One final point is that in our analysis of the site and how it would be best to protect it, we looked at other other cities with large sites, and we determined that it was most appropriate to designate it under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act as a complex, rather than a heritage district under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, because this gives more flexibility as the development process unrolls. The official plan gives the city the ability to designate structures, buildings, and cultural heritage landscapes under the Ontario Heritage Act. Again, in Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act provides the ability for designation of individual heritage buildings. The next slides that I'm going to give are one by one of every building in the complex. I know there's quite a few that are being recommended for inclusion, but I think it's the best way to get an idea of what's there. The map on your left was prepared by ERA Architects, who are the heritage consultant on the sites. With their permission, I have reproduced it here, and it shows the periods of construction in color, so up to 29, 30, etc. And then circled in red are the buildings that are on the right. And I must thank my colleague Ashley for doing this, because her talents exceed mine. And I'm just doing them in alphabetical order. I do not know how they got their letters, but because it certainly wasn't chronological, but we'll be going through in alphabetical order. So buildings A and B, A is the building on the top, and B is attached to its rear, are recommended for inclusion. They are part of the Physical Metallurgy Research Laboratories, and the front part was devoted to offices. A was devoted to offices, and B was a link to the rear of the building. Also on this site, E, which is they all have roughly the same name. Again, Physical Metallurgy Labs, built in 1945 to 1947, so near the end of the construction period. So that's also included. Our next building is the central heating plant. This building was not designated by the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office, but during the extensive consultation held with the community, this emerged as quite a beloved building, partly because of its chimney. The chimney is a landscape in the area, and there was great interest in having this protected and incorporated into the new site. So other noteworthy characteristics of this building are the large hopper-style industrial windows and the doors and the characteristic white foundation. This building was built also in 45 to 47, and it shows the sort of the maturation of the site when it was so complex that it warranted having a central heating plant for the entire site. The next building is Building G, which is a fuel testing laboratory. It started out as a two-story building with a wing at the back, which is Building H. A third story was added later. One of the noteworthy things about this building is that it has the distinctive entablature and doorway that many people associate with the site. You also see virtually the same doorway on buildings M, Q, and R, which are coming up. And then again behind it is Building H. It was built in 1927 to 29. It has a monitor roof, which was important for its function, and again the cornice slightly below the edge of the monitor, and the typical very large window openings. These are not the original windows. It also had industrial windows, but they were replaced at some point by National Resources Canada. And then I did them out of order, so we have to go to the next one. Building M is the next one. It is the Metallurgical Ore Dressing Laboratory. It was built in 1932. Again, the distinctive entablature. It is also slightly more decorated than some of the others with these metal spandrel panels, and it shares the distinctive red brick, secondary cornice, use of stone for string courses. and attached to it are buildings N1, N2, and N3, which are small gable-roofed structures that were built much earlier than M, including the oldest building on the site, which is a fuel testing lab, N1. There is a hydrometallurgical lab, building 2 from 1929, and then another N3 is also from 1929. Again, it's a bit dark, the photo, I apologize, but again, distinctive industrial-style windows are also featured on these buildings, the sloped metal roofs and the chimneys, which just sort of speak of its industrial function. Where are we? And finally, we have perhaps the best known buildings on the site, buildings Q and R. They faced Lydia Street, which is no longer exists, and their location was also had a lot to do with the railway and the delivery of ore for testing to the buildings. So building Q is the other building on the site with a monitor roof, and it again faced the former railway tracks, and with a distinctive front doorway. You can see that the large flanking doors were for delivery of ore to the site. And then building R, the final building, was built in 1937-39, and it was constructed for research and development on non-metallic industrial minerals such as clay, gypsum, mica, etc. And all of the functions here were the federal government looking for commercial uses and the best way to process ore. So they were to assist the mining and extraction and fuel industries in Canada. There are 4 buildings that we haven't recommended for inclusion. This slide shows buildings C and D, which are part of the large A to E complex. Building C, we concurred with the heritage consultant with ERA Architects that C and D would not be recommended for inclusion. C, because it is not an outstanding example of the utilitarian wings built behind the buildings in the 1940s, and D, because it was devoted solely to offices and is typical of other office buildings of the era in Ottawa. Also, it's a lot of what we looked at is that this is a balancing act to balance the heritage of the area and to keep it as so that it continued to tell the story of an industrial complex within the city of Ottawa constructed by the federal government, but also it will be redeveloped, and so there are practical aspects to look at, and the inclusion of parks and public spaces and places for development. So D is actually the site of a public park that is recommended for the area, and a lot of this, the need for a park, etc., that is also what came out of the extensive public consultations that Canada Lands undertook during the process. Also not included are Building L, which was built in the 50s, which is the only building that was not didn't have any influence of W.E. Noffke, and it was a tailings disposal building, and we agreed with ERA that as a disposal building, its function was secondary to the function of the site as a whole, and its character and style does not exemplify the character of the complex. And then P, which is next, which is at the end of the end-to-end buildings, was not included, again, to assist in the functionality of the site. This is just a map that shows the buildings in blue are to be retained and the crosshatch buildings are to be removed. So it does show the percentage of historic buildings that are being retained on the site. And in terms of which ones were previously designated by FIBRO, Building P was, and C and D were designated by FIBRO. Building L, the large one in the middle on Rochester Street, was not, and neither was the central heating plant. But again, because of the local interest in the central heating plant, that was added in. The site plan above this slide shows the proposed site plan for the site. And again, this is what will be the subject of the zoning bylaw amendment and the official plan amendment that will be going to Planning Committee on the 28th of February. This plan was developed after, during and finalized after the extensive consultation period undertaken by Canada Lands. Just briefly, the retained buildings are pink, and there are, when you see a white building on top of a pink building, that means that it will be zoned for some height there, but every intervention to a pink building will require an application under the Ontario Heritage Act, as is always the case for an alteration of a building designated under the Act. And for alterations to the buildings themselves, to adapt them and reuse them, that will also be the subject of heritage permits under the Act. But the new buildings that are freestanding will not require permits under the Act, but they will be regulated through and looked at through cultural heritage impact statements and design guidelines that are being developed for the site. So this proposed development respects the resources of the site, including the labs, offices, and testing facilities that have characterized it for so many years. The broad range of buildings make it possible through the development process to continue to tell the history of the site. The site plan also retains the identity of the complex as a whole, tied together by design details, the Noffke-inspired design details such as the red brick, the use of stone, etc. And the proposed site plan retains the informal layout of the property based on its function. So again, just the technical parts of the Ontario Heritage Act. It requires that one of the criteria be met: design, physical value, associated historical value, and contextual value for buildings recommended for designation. Again, the Booth Street complex has design value as Ottawa example of a federal government complex, housing, offices, laboratories, etc. And it also has design value for its architectural expression, typical of 1930s and 40s federal government building, illustrated in red brick, classicizing details, flat roofs, and windows and doors suited to its industrial function. It has historical value through its association with the mines branch and the work that it has done with Canadian mining industries throughout the 20th century. Its association with Noffke that I mentioned in the presentation also is part of its associative value. And then it has contextual value because of its landmark status, its association with Natural Resources Canada, and its tall chimney. Consultation, the Housing Community Association was notified of the designation and were certainly present at all of the public consultation that was taken. Canada Lands and its heritage consultants, we were privileged to work very closely with them throughout the process in the decision-making process that led to the recommendation in this report. This was a remarkably collaborative effort, and I think because of that, the development applications were stronger and the heritage applications were also stronger. It was a privilege to work with in such a collaborative way. Heritage Ottawa was notified of the proposed designation, and the ward councillor is also aware of the designation. So in conclusion, the Booth Street complex meets the criteria of the Ontario Regulation 0906, and we recommend a notice of intention to designate under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. We have a few questions. Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to staff for this. This has been a long process in the making of this, and I have to say that I want to start by saying that the consultative process that Canada Lands Corporation undertook was exceptional, really. We had 3 large public open houses, we had many focus groups, walked residents around the neighborhood, sat in coffee shops near the neighborhood, really thought through what the built form here would be, how it would integrate into the existing community, because we are going to be adding density, height, and really, this never housed people. This block in this part of the downtown. So I just have to say that Canada Lands Corporation, the process that they undertook was exceptional, and we could learn a lot from it. Just a plug. I've suggested that LeBreton Flats undergo the same process with CLC. So I may have added to your work plan. Also, the central heating plant on Rochester. I think that recognizing that local landmark, that smokestack that was identified as something that the community sees every day, has some affinity to, but also in terms of the new built environment, the new height, the new park, the heritage aspects of this block. I'm very happy to see that was included in the concept plan or in this report, and of course in the concept plan for the entire block. So, although my comments were simply that I was aware of the report, I will admit to falling down on a job a little bit there. I really should have made more specific comments. One question that I did have was, because this plan also needs rezoning and an official plan application that will be going to committee and council. I guess, will that be happening concurrent, or will this finish before we see that application?
It will be concurrent. So the recommendation for designation will go to Planning Committee on February 28th, which is the same day that the official plan amendment and the zoning bylaw amendment will be considered by Planning Committee, and then it will go to City Council at the same time.
Okay, and that's what I thought. So, how do we ensure that the heritage buildings get rehabilitated? Like, what is the process for that? As we move forward and the land is severed and sold to different developers, presumably, hopefully, how do we ensure those designated buildings actually get rehabilitated and preserved?
The Ontario Heritage Act has no way of making sure that a building is redeveloped. However, again, what the Heritage Act does have is the provisions through which it can be, that it will be, when it is redeveloped, it will be done properly through an application under the Heritage Act. If some of the buildings stand vacant as a developer takes up a site and they search for uses or whatever, then through the property standards bylaw we can make sure that they are safe and watertight and properly protected. But we can't actually, through the Heritage Act, force anyone to develop them. They will buy them. One would assume that as they're released, the developers will be buying them because they're interested in their adaptive reuse, but we can't, through the Heritage Act, formally require them to be developed. We can keep them safe and make sure they're treated properly through the alteration process, though.
Okay, and I can appreciate that. However, I am also the councillor representing the ward that includes Somerset House, so I have always reason to worry about heritage buildings and keeping them just, within our the bounds of our property standards and our building code services. So is there any way, and I don't want to, presume that the same thing's going to happen, but these are important heritage buildings. Is there any way through the planning process then, or maybe this is a question for planning, to put some type of holding zone on the plan so that we are absolutely certain that they will get, at the very least, well rehabilitated?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we are exploring holding provision in terms of the recommendations for the zoning coming forward that would be subject to applications, the future conceptual applications for site plan or plan of subdivision, or the more specific development applications as they come on board. So through that process, we can look at specific conditions surrounding, as we work with the future developers, surrounding if there's specific elements of the heritage that might be incorporated into conditions at that stage through that process.
Okay, so I'll wait to see that through the planning process then.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's it.
Okay, Member Smallwood and then Councillor Brockington.
Thank you. I just wondered, you mentioned about the additional flexibility from having it designated under Part 4 rather than Part 5, which I get because I guess since certain buildings aren't designated, this would just allow them to be demolished more quickly. And I just wondered, was there, and I'm not sure, but is there any benefit under Part 5 that you're losing because the new buildings don't have as much, or don't have to relate to the old buildings as much, or are they still protected equally under Part 4 and Part 5? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, that's a very good question, because there is, for the buildings that aren't going to be attached, the freestanding buildings that won't be attached to one of the designated resources, that could be, which is why we have been working with Canada Lands on design guidelines which would govern the development of the site as it's released, and that would also ensure that because the chances are there could be more than one developer, so you're looking for consistency across the site. So that is why we're developing tools like that, and again, in concert with the land use planning process.
Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you and to colleagues. I will be supporting the recommendation. I see great potential and opportunity in this location for a mixed-use complex that respects sort of the heritage of the area and can incorporate some of the older buildings. And I'm glad to hear from Councillor McKenney the involvement and engagement of the community, which is very important. Having worked, I guess I'm still on the books as an employee, but I worked at Tunney's Pasture for 16 years, and the buildings at Tunney certainly don't win any beauty contest awards for architecture. They are standard, bland, concrete buildings that house public servants. And it's a shame in Ottawa that for a nation's capital, we have so few buildings, in my opinion, I'm certainly not an expert, that can incorporate smart architecture instead of sort of the bland concrete towers that I see around this great city of ours. And so when I look at this complex and I think about the distillery district, and I don't know if it was a media article I read or whether it was in the details of the report, that has incorporated the historic buildings and modernized opportunities and offerings for the people of Toronto in that district. It's great. It really is great. And certainly I hope that is the direction that this complex can go towards. I thought you had a good opportunity to really provide details in your report about the three components, about how the designation, the criteria for a designation. I thought it was very, very brief, too brief. The design component, you have one sentence. You talk about red brick construction, flat roofs, simple classically inspired details. That's certainly not strong enough to convince me of the value. Historical and associative value, is it the age of the buildings, or is it more of what went on there and the contribution certainly during the war period and all the research that went on there? And finally, for the contextual value, your last sentence makes me scratch my head because you say it's historic association with the NRC buildings across the street, and the long-term presence of the entire complex have defined the character of this part of the city since the early 20th century. Well, I've lived in this city my whole life, and I define that area basically as Little Italy and Chinatown, and have paid little attention to this part of town as far as a federal government area. Maybe it's stronger for the people who live there, but I've seen in passing hundreds of times sort of old buildings that really have not contributed a lot. But the fact that this report is public and we're more talking about opportunities going forward, I think there is opportunity. That's why I'm supportive of the recommendation. But these buildings, for me, are average. There's no significant physical component that would sway me. It's the sum of the arguments in the three categories and the opportunities that we can see within this complex that sway me to vote in favor. And I think there is value in providing this heritage designation. I think there's absolute opportunity to incorporate modern needs, mixed-use modern needs with this historical complex. I think that's where we need to head towards. But I think staff had a great opportunity to go into great detail about the values here. I just don't see it. I see sort of very light rationale for this recommendation, when in fact there's some great history here at this site.
Member Quinn?
Thank you. Yes, my question is about the three FIBRO designated buildings that we're not keeping as part of the development. I'm just wondering if there is a plan to document these buildings in any way before they're gone. There isn't, but certainly I think that that's a very good idea. We can work with Canada Lands and ERA on that particular aspect. Certainly, there is documentation in terms of architectural plans, etc. But yes, we could do that. Okay, thank you. And I just want to also support my colleague, Councillor McKenney, in terms of putting some guidelines in place about making sure that the heritage buildings that are part of the complex are protected and invested in as the whole site is developed. Councillor McKenney referenced Somerset House. Of course, while I've been on this committee, I can also think of the Sœurs de la Visitation site, which has had stages of development, and the original convent, as we know, is languishing to some extent. I mean, obviously it's secured, but I think we need to be more proactive in that regard. And certainly I liked the UDRP suggestion of having strong, detailed design guidelines right up front, and you referenced those, and I support that as well. And then I just wanted to take a little moment to comment on Councillor Brockington's most recent comments. Just to say that sometimes one of our roles here and the city and under the Ontario Heritage Act is not necessarily to only be preserving the best examples of a particular type, and in this case it would be industrial architecture, but it also has to be, I think, considered within the context and the complex. So each one of those buildings in and of itself may not shine, but it's the relationship that they have with each other and the history of the activity and the reasons why industrial architecture may not always be grand, and of course the time period out of which some of these, the economic constraints, etc., all speak to the evolution of the site. So, but great comments, and I think good food for thought as we make decisions about how we preserve the heritage. And so thank you very much, and I too will be supporting this recommendation.
Member Podolsky.
Yes, thank you very much. Although this portion of the meeting presumably is to pose questions to staff, because I don't know if there are any public delegations and discussion afterwards, but it's a good opportunity for me, who am very familiar with this complex, and the alphabet soup of building names. I've been tracking this project for over 10 years, and I think that this is the perfect time really to compliment Canada Lands Company for taking on this site and for coming up with a very, very enlightened land use and development concept. They are also clearly, by supporting the designation of this complex under Part 4 of the Heritage Act, serving the federal government policy for ensuring that FIBRO designated buildings have new lives and are concerned. So there's nothing but praise that I have for Canada Lands Company, and also for its undertaking the public consultation process. The addition of the central heating plant building to the designated buildings is also way beyond what I would ever have expected. I'm delighted to see that, and I think there's credit to the community and to the city planning and heritage staff and the consultants that were retained by Canada Lands Company to initiate this project. This is a major, major landmark in terms of the planning process, and a very good file to start 2019 at the City of Ottawa Built Heritage process, and I look forward to the Planning Committee recommendation on the land use zoning and designation on February 28th. Even though Sally's presentation was very low-key and maybe didn't satisfy my colleague Councillor Blockington for enthusiasm, but really I think that this is a landmark site and may very well be the one that contributes to the attraction of people to the capital. And I only have to compare it to other sites that had great promise, like Lansdowne Park. But I think this one, I think Toronto, beware with your distillery district. This one is going to be better.
We actually do have one public delegation signed up to speak. We have Mary Jarvis and Victoria Angel from the Canada Lands Company. If you want to come up and take a seat at the front next to Sally. Do you have a presentation or just comments for the committee? Okay, just press, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, all good.
Am I on? Good morning, committee. My name is Mary Jarvis. I'm the director of real estate for Canada Lands Company. We're happy to be here this morning presenting Booth Street Complex. My colleague here, Victoria Angel, is our heritage planner and has worked with us through this process, so I will turn it over to Victoria.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning. I'm just going to say a few words about the heritage planning rationale for the planning application that's gone to the city, which we contributed to and which resulted in the concept plan, which is shown again on screen. So the heritage planning rationale was informed by our discussions with stakeholders and community members regarding the value of the site and how they see it evolving in the future. It was also informed by advice that we received from the UDRP, and in particular their recommendation to conserve the sense of the ensemble. And then it was also informed by field investigations that we undertook that helped us to better understand the nature and construction of each building and their adaptive reuse potential. As Sally has explained, each of the 5 laboratory complexes tells a specific story about Canadian mining, metallurgy, and fuels research. The complex as a whole is also a reminder of the industrial activities and development that existed within the immediate setting of the Booth Street complex, and as such, we believe the site represents a rich opportunity for both rehabilitation and interpretation. This had to be balanced, however, with conservation challenges associated with the layout, configuration, and construction of some of the facilities, and it had to be balanced with a need to create penetrations to the site and removals in order to create circulation routes and a new public realm and to accommodate the new development. So first of all, we worked to achieve the retention of all or major parts of all 5 laboratory buildings, as well as the smokestack. And then we also undertook an analysis of the attributes of the complex as a whole, and this really is what informed the resulting concept plan. So first of all, we aim to retain a reading of the site as a coherent ensemble, and this is something that's achieved in part through the red brick construction and the use of the simple classical features on the majority of the structures. There, we aim to retain the mix of highly functional and industrial buildings with more formal structures. We aim to conserve the sense of the very marked topography of the site, which rises steeply from its southwest corner. Something that we felt was very important were the irregular and fluid open spaces between buildings resulting from the organic evolution and arrangement of the buildings and complexes across the site, their irregular forms, and their density across the property. There were the formal public frontages along Booth and Lydia Streets with the informal working entrances within the site. And then there was the character of continual change, adaptation, and reorganization, which really illustrates a particular pattern of development that characterizes the site. And then finally, there was also the layering and juxtaposition of forms and features in the views of the site from Preston Street. So these were the major heritage planning considerations that went into this concept plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from our committee members for Canada Lands? Councillor Brockington.
I apologize if I'm the only one that doesn't know the answer to this, but is it the government's plan to retain ownership of the buildings and control the tenants that come in there, or is it the long-term plan to sell that? And I ask that just because I think you have better control over retaining and preserving the heritage than if a new owner were to come in. So can you just clarify what the long-term ownership plans are?
Thank you, and through the chair. Canada Land's approach is to add value to the site, to rezone the site. We will remediate and demolish buildings that will not be retained and release the site to the market. So we do not hold buildings for long periods of time, but through our marketing process, the architectural design guidelines, and perhaps other tools that we can employ together with the City of Ottawa, we can encourage people to reinvest in the heritage buildings, protect the heritage buildings for the longer term. And essentially with the Heritage Act designation, there's a greater potential for full retention over time.
And Member Podolsky.
This is a friendly question for you. One of the things that obviously is of interest to all is that the buildings that are designated find an appropriate economic use and that they are conserved and adapted and added to at a time which doesn't end up being at the end of the project, the no child left behind. I think that was one of the points that was being raised to ensure that, unlike the foreign tech administrative building, which suffered the dilemma of being designated building, the site has been redeveloped, and that was the last one to be developed. I think that the best efforts should be made, and maybe in the planning approval, that there is a mechanism, and this is not a heritage issue, but it certainly speaks to the need to ensure that the buildings that are designated are aggressively brought on stream like the new buildings. And I think that's something, obviously, that the City of Ottawa and Canada Lands Company both share. And just wanted to raise that point and reinforce the comments that have been made by others to ensure that there is a schedule that brings those buildings as much as possible on stream through the private sector in ways that they're economically viable at the same time. I know this has always been the biggest challenge for those buildings over Canada Lands Company's thinking about the site over the last decade. Thank you.
Do you want to comment to that, or?
Thank you. We'll be working with Erin and her team.
Okay. Thanks very much for your presentation today. If there aren't any other questions, I don't think so. Are the report recommendations carried? Carried. Okay. Carried. Moving on to our second item, from the Office of the City Clerk and Solicitor, Legislative Services, the Built Heritage Subcommittee Terms of Reference. I will note that we have correspondence submitted to the Clerk's Office on this from Heather MacArthur and David Fleming from Heritage Ottawa, received on February 8th, a letter to the Mayor dated November 23rd, 2018. Are there any committee member questions to staff or any remarks from the committee? I would like to say that these terms of reference are shaped in many ways by comments we received from the community, in particular Heritage Ottawa and members of Ottawa's Heritage Conservation Districts. And I think they're a positive update as this committee continues to evolve in its mandate. And I know it's always a good thing whenever we can take a few things off of Planning Chair Jan Harder's plate for the planning meeting. So, are the report recommendations carried? Carried. Thank you. There are no in-camera items today. Any notices of motion for consideration at a subsequent meeting? Seeing none. Any inquiries? None. Other business. A technical circulation. We have an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment proposal summary for 100 Argyle Avenue. There is a technical circulation. Committee members received this circulation in December and had the opportunity to comment. And the last thing I want to do before we adjourn is remind you that next week, Tuesday, February 19th, is Heritage Day. And we have the annual Ottawa Heritage Awards as part of that at the University of Ottawa in the evening. There's a Heritage Day event here at City Hall. And I hope that you can all attend those events. Our next meeting is March 12th. And on adjournment, is the motion carried? Carried. Thank you. We're adjourned.